How's everyone doing this fine weekend? Can you believe it? 2019 is almost over. Geez, I feel so old. To celebrate the turn of the, decade, I guess, we're going to be responding to this new video that PragerU put out. Yes, I know, not much of a celebration. They usually do political videos on their channel, and since I'm not interested in making political stuff, I don't really bat them an eye, but every so often they release something that either promotes creationism or something against atheism. Thanks to those who sent this video to me. I don't watch other channels very often, so something like this would have slipped by me.
Evolution. You learned about it in high school. It goes like this. Life started out with very simple forms, and then gradually, over hundreds of millions of years, morphed into all the forms we see today. Bacteria to Beethoven.
Well, no, that's actually just a conclusion that evolution arrived at, not what evolution itself states. But you know, you're a creationist, so we'll give you a free pass on not knowing what evolution is. I mean, we've only given you like 50 million of them already.
This was the theory proposed by Charles Darwin in 1859, and with some modification, it's been embraced as unassailable by the scientific community over the last century.
Ah, Stephen Meyer. You know, sometimes I like to Google the people I'm responding to, just for fun. He has a whole Wikipedia page, and the first line says he's an advocator for the pseudoscientific idea of intelligent design. Imagine getting your own Wikipedia page, and the first line calls you a pseudoscientist.
As evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins says, if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, or insane.
Ignorant, yes. Stupid, yes. Insane, I don't know. The fact of the matter is, evolution has so much evidence for it that you'd have to be at least ignorant to disagree with it. I mean, I get it if you're not educated enough to be able to understand or interpret the pieces of evidence for it, but not knowing is different than not believing in it.
But is that right? Are there no scientific reasons to doubt the evolutionary account of life's origins?
If you have scientific evidence in favor of your position of intelligent design, be sure to write a paper. You'll change the world.
In November 2016, I attended a conference in London convened by some of the world's leading evolutionary biologists. The purpose? To address growing doubts about the modern version of Darwin's theory.
The f***? I'm gonna go ahead and doubt that there was such a meeting, held by the world's leading evolutionary biologists, no less, whatever the hell that means, to get together and plot against resistant ideas on evolution. Forgive me if I have trouble believing such an event existed, but you know, you do you.
Let's look at just two scientific reasons to doubt this theory. First, the Cambrian Explosion. A weird and wonderful thing happened 530 million years ago. A whole bunch of major groups of animals, what scientists call the phyla.
Phylum is just a name for the classification system, so calling it phyla by itself isn't correct. It's actually the various Animalia phyla, which there are 30-some. Look at me nitpicking.
Appeared abruptly within a geologically short window of time. About 10 million years.
Ah yes, the Cambrian Explosion, a very common argument that creationists like to bring up. It sure was a weird event, wasn't it? Before then, life was generally simple in structure and function. Until that explosion happened and bam, complex organisms began to dominate and diverge into all the major groups of animals. And this happened over like, I don't know, 15 to 20 million years? Don't get me wrong, that's actually a lot of time. Of course, there have been scientific ideas being thrown around in the community to address the Cambrian Explosion. And you know what? Creationists like to make claims like these without going into what scientists themselves are saying about it. Come on, you really think the scientific community would let this slide without giving it possible explanations? Currently, there's not just one factor that caused it. We know it's most likely a combination of factors that played a role. Here are some explanations that have been given already. It's important to note that the Cambrian Explosion could be easily explained by a very accelerated evolutionary phase, not impossible evolution. So all you have to do is identify what caused the evolutionary pressures. 520 million years ago, there were massive changes in the ocean systems and ecosystems in general. There's no doubt that a combination of survival pressures facilitated the accelerated changes in organisms. For example, one factor was likely the increase in photosynthetic activity, which increased the overall amount of oxygen in the air. That allowed organisms to adapt and become more complex due to greater abilities to consume and utilize oxygen for metabolism. Another example is the glaciation of Earth, which could have killed a lot of organisms. This leaves the gene pool of populations to be smaller than usual, which increases evolutionary rate due to bottlenecking. Of course, there are many other explanations, and it was likely a combination of these that caused the Cambrian Explosion. But anyway, Stephen really isn't here to talk about evolution rates during that time period. He has something else in mind, so let's have a look.
These novel animal forms, exhibiting prototypes of most animal body designs we see today, emerged in the fossil record without evidence of earlier ancestors. Did you catch that? A huge number of diverse animals appeared with no discernible antecedents.
Well, no, you never just assume there's no ancestor just because you can't find the physical remains of one. Sure, according to the fossil record, it appears as if the animals came into existence out of nowhere, that they don't have ancestors. However, we obviously know that's not the case because the only way we see this is through fossils. There's a bias towards what the fossil record shows. If you have a hard skeleton or shell, for example, it is much more likely to be preserved. So we don't see a lot of soft-bodied organisms. So a favoritism in hard-bodied organisms could likely be the reason we saw this explosion, and makes it seem as if there were no ancestors. As the environment favored organisms with complexity and hard shells or skeletons, they adapt to fit that condition. And then in the fossil record, it looks to appear as if there was a sudden entry of organisms when in reality we just couldn't see them before. So in that case, their ancestors would have just been invisible in the fossil record.
So where did they come from? This question really bothered Darwin, and he acknowledged that he could give it no satisfactory answer.
Darwin did find it problematic, but he doesn't actually represent modern evolutionary theory, due to how many changes and adjustments we've made to it since then. I always say this to creationists, and I'll say it again, it doesn't matter what Darwin thought.
Nor can scientists today.
Well, that's obviously false.
The renowned biologist Eugene Koonin of the National Center for Biotechnology Information describes the abrupt appearance of the Cambrian animals and other organisms such as dinosaurs, birds, flowering plants, and mammals as a pattern of biological Big Bangs.
Okay, why does that matter? I doubt he meant it in a way to suggest something against evolution, but even if he did, I don't think I'll trust any individual scientist over the consensus of the scientific community.
So what caused all these new forms of life to arise? That question leads to a second big doubt, the DNA enigma. In the 1950s, James Watson and Francis Crick made a startling discovery. The DNA molecule stores information as a 4-character digital code. Strings of precisely sequenced chemicals inside the DNA helix store the instructions, the information, for building the crucial proteins that cells need to survive.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone knows this already.
Unless the chemical letters in the DNA text are sequenced properly, a protein molecule will not form.
Well, actually, as long as the gene is being transcribed and translated, a protein will always form no matter the sequence. If you have an AUG start, that piece of DNA will always form a protein under those conditions. It may not be a functional one, but it's still a protein. Of course, that means you'll need to have the proper transcription factors and enzymes, and the resulting RNA must be a messenger RNA, but those aren't really dependent on the DNA sequence of that gene itself.
No proteins, no cells. No cells, no living organisms.
Gee, how did you know that one? Anyway, I'm gonna let the video play for a bit so he can finish his point before I nitpick something new.
Bill Gates has said DNA is like a software program. Let's think about that for a second. For computers to run faster and perform more functions, they require new code. Well, the same is true for life. To build new forms of life, the evolutionary process would need to produce new genetic information, new code. But this raises questions about the creative power of natural selection and mutation. Natural selection is a simple sorting process. Species keep favorable mutations that allow them to survive, but eliminate bad mutations that cause their members to die out. No one doubts that natural selection is a real process, and that it produces minor variations. But many biologists now doubt that it produces major innovations in biological form.
Well, that's actually not true. Biologists don't say that. Please don't strawman them. Technically, any type of change is possible. It depends entirely on environmental pressures and evolutionary factors. We're not just talking about natural selection here. By the way, you're being incredibly vague here, and you don't go into more detail, so we'll leave it at that.
To see why, think again about software. What happens if you introduce a few random changes into computer code? You'll likely mess it up, right? Though it might still work if you don't make too many changes. But if you make enough random changes, your program will stop functioning altogether. You certainly can't keep doing this and expect some cool new program to pop out. There's a mathematical reason for this. In all codes and languages, there are vastly more ways of arranging characters that will generate gibberish than there are arrangements that will generate meaningful sequences. And this applies to DNA.
No, you cannot compare computer code with DNA. Although they are somewhat similar in concept, they are not the same in reality. In code, yes, they have to be specific. Any small change can generate a syntax error that could ultimately break it. But that's not the case for DNA, not even close. See, I'm currently doing a master's in bioinformatics, and we look at DNA all the time. One of the few things you come to realize is that DNA and proteins are incredibly non-specific. They can undergo many changes and still retain the same function. This is due to many reasons. First, most DNA does not code for a functional protein. There are more often either junk or regulatory sequences that does not necessarily serve a direct purpose in the structures of the protein itself. Second, you can change the DNA sequence without changing the resulting protein. This one is actually less relevant compared to the other points. Third, even if you do change the protein or DNA sequence, it may very well still retain its primary function. Just look at related organisms in a blast result. They generally have multiple differences between them but are conserved enough. In fact, you can even map out these differences and create a phylogenetic tree with it. That's right, you can just take these proteins and draw an ancestral tree based on it, and it matches the actual tree fairly well. The point is, changes in a DNA sequence does not destroy it like it does a computer code. DNA is very flexible, so what happens? You introduce a bunch of changes through mutations, and then the beneficial ones will be selected out by natural selection. It's that simple, and since now we know that mutations most likely do not destroy the function of DNA and proteins, it's fairly easy to imagine how this is possible.
Remember, natural selection only selects sequences that random mutations generate. Yet experiments have established that DNA sequences capable of making stable proteins are extremely rare, and thus really hard to stumble on randomly.
If you start from scratch and just create a gene by randomly assigning letters, then yes, getting a protein with the proper function can be difficult, but that's not what happens in reality. You already have a template to start off with, and random changes in that template will cause changes, yes, but more likely it won't drastically affect the gene's function. And whenever a useful change does occur, natural selection snatches it up and spreads it throughout the population. Don't forget, we're talking about entire populations here, with hundreds, thousands, and millions of members, each having their own variations and mutations of DNA. So it's very easy for the favorable gene change to be present already before the environment selects that out via natural selection. Overall, I think you just fundamentally don't understand evolution by natural selection.
So, two serious doubts about modern Darwinian theory: the Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of new animals, which evolutionary theory has failed to explain, and the DNA enigma, the implausibility of random mutations producing the information needed to build new forms of animal life. Scientists who know about these problems are not ignorant, stupid, or insane. They are just appropriately skeptical.
Actually, scientists who know about these, quote, problems don't see them as problems at all because either they have been explained scientifically, like for the Cambrian explosion, or the problem just doesn't exist, like your DNA enigma concern. Anyway, that's the end of the video today, guys. Thank you again for watching. Hopefully we won't talk about evolution and creationism again next week, just to keep the content fresh. Shout out to Fireshard for being the all-time top supporter, as well as everyone else who has decided to help me through difficult times. Bye.